Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, One Runner to Rule Them All. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping notes so you know how to participate in today's event. You should see on your Zoom webinar control panel at the bottom of the Zoom window. You should can you use the Q&A feature to submit questions for today's presenters, Wim and Eyal. In addition to submitting your own questions there, you will also be able to view and upvote questions submitted by other attendees. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation and we'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. If you have any technical issues or need support during the event, please contact us via the Zoom chat or email us at webinar@saucelabs.com. Finally, I'd like to remind everyone that today's presentation is being recorded and you'll receive an email with links to view the recording and slides following the event. It is now my pleasure to introduce Wim Selles and Eyal Yovel. Wim is a senior solutions architect at SauceLabs. He helps solve automation challenges by day and practices his passion for front-end test automation at night. Wim enjoys creating his own Node.js modules and contributing to open source projects. Eyal is a solutions architect at SauceLabs, where he works with organizations to improve their testing practices. He has a passion for learning new technologies and new testing frameworks. Without further ado, I'll turn this over to Wim and Eyal.
Hey everybody, welcome to this webinar about one runner to rule them all, to use source control to execute all your frameworks. And when we're talking about this title, one runner to rule them all, where have I seen that before? Well, maybe you know this one. One ring to rule them all. That was the first thing that Eyal and I were thinking about. And well, we're not going to talk about Lord of the Rings today. We might have some references to Lord of the Rings, but we're going to talk about one runner to rule them all. Basically, how SauceLabs can help you run a lot of the automation frameworks out there in SauceLabs with only one runner. But before we dive into SauceCTL, let's first look at the agenda, what we're going to do today. First of all, Eyal and me are going to introduce ourselves. Then we're going to look into the question, why did we create one runner to rule them all? Then we will dive into some native JavaScript frameworks, and then also some native mobile frameworks. And then at the end, we hopefully have some time also for Q&A. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we will address them at the end of the session. And if not, we will also provide the questions and the answers afterwards in an email. So first of all, let me introduce to you Eyal. Eyal, welcome to this session. Can you tell a little bit more about yourself?
Hi, everyone. Yes, thank you, Wim. My name is Eyal Yovel. I'm a solution architect at SauceLabs. I'm based in London, UK. I have over 15 years of experience in software development and software automation. And as Maddie mentioned in the beginning, I have passions for learning new technologies and new test frameworks. And isn't this webinar about new technology and frameworks? You can see here how you can find me in Twitter and in GitHub. And back to you, Wim.
Okay, thanks, Eyal. And just one thing I wanted to mention about Eyal. I thought that I was a workaholic, but I've seen Eyal working even during hours that I was sleeping. So yeah, welcome also Eyal to also share your knowledge with us. And yeah, let me also introduce myself for the people who don't know me. My name is Wim Selles. I'm a senior solutions architect at SauceLabs since, 2018. Been working in the industry for more than 12 years as a consultant in the Netherlands. Also the contributing author to 2 books. I wrote 2 chapters in 2 books of a friend of mine. One chapter was about how to use open source software in large organizations. And a second chapter I wrote in his book was about how to use React Native together with Appium and some best practices. If you want to order them, you can order them on Amazon. I'm not earning any money from it, but yeah, I think there is some valuable information also in there. Like many already mentioned, I'm an open source enthusiastic guy. I love JavaScript, I love mobile, and you can also find me a lot in the open source community, trying to help people with answering questions or with creating some packages that might make life easier when we're talking about automation. If you want to know more about me, you can find me on Twitter, or you can find also me on GitHub. And if you search my name on LinkedIn, I think you will also find me. So if you want to connect, feel free to do that. But enough about ourselves, enough about Eyal and about me. Let's get back. Let's get back to where you all came for. Basically, one runner to rule them all. And let's just dive into that. Let's not dive into that. Let's get back. Let's get back into history. And then I'm not talking about the time where the elves, the dwarves, and men are given rings of power. No, I want to go back to the period where real automation started. And with real automation started, I mean when basically Selenium started. Let's get back to a timeline. Let's get back to 2004. I want to walk with you over all these years, and I want to highlight a few things that are very important for us people who are doing some automation. And I also want to give you some differences, and in the end, also the reason why we created SauceCTL, basically that one runner to rule all those frameworks. And like I mentioned, 2004, that was the year where Jason Huggins, also the founder of SauceLabs, created Selenium. And in 2005, a colleague of him created WebDriver, the WebDriver Protocol, 2 different protocols to basically automate a browser. In 2008, Jason was smart enough to start SauceLabs. That's basically why we're here. And in 2009, they came together, Simon and Jason, and basically created the Selenium WebDriver Protocol. That's basically the protocol to automate web applications on your desktop. But there was also a very smart guy who created Appium. And in 2012, there was the first Appium release. Also something that we supported in 2012 already in SauceLabs. Again, a protocol that you could use to automate or a web application on a mobile device, like you could do that with Selenium on desktop devices, or to automate native applications or hybrid applications on your mobile devices. But in the years that followed, also a lot of developers figured out that these tools were not the best tools for them. They had different needs. And in 2014, one of the biggest vendors created a new automation framework for Android applications. It was called Espresso, and currently we're still using Espresso to automate specific parts of native applications. Then in 2015, Apple came with a new release, the XCUITest suite, that could help you automate iOS native applications. And this was basically the start where developers could also automate the UI, but not in the same way that we could do that with Appium or with Selenium. No, by basically doing the test cases very close to the application itself. And we will get back to that later on. But what also happened is in 2016, there was a first release of TestCafe. And TestCafe is a automation framework, a JavaScript-based automation framework, which can automate websites on desktops and also on an emulator and a simulator. But it took a different approach in comparison to Appium and Selenium. We will also get back to that one later on. Then in 2017, Puppeteer and Cypress were released. Also 2 automation frameworks, JavaScript-based, that did it in a different way than Selenium and Appium were doing that. And then last but not least, in 2020, we got the first Playwright release. Also, again, a automation framework, JavaScript-based, that could automate browser applications, or basically browsers, the websites in those browsers. And again, something different in comparison to Selenium and Appium. And well, then we've got 2021. Well, that's basically the year that we have this webinar. But if you would look at this slide, you would also see a difference in color. And let me make it a little bit easier. You can also see that there is basically, we can draw a line there, where on the left, we would have basically the automation tools that are focused on web or on mobile, but basically on a protocol, a WebDriver protocol. And on the right, we would have automation frameworks that behave differently because their technique that they use is different. And let's dive a little bit more into that, because if we're talking about the technique, then we can distinguish them and say we've got a WebDriver protocol, basically an HTTPS call going from your automation framework to a device or to your website, and we have a native protocol. A native protocol basically executing test cases more closely to the system under test. And let's dive a little bit more into that and explain what we mean with that. First of all, if we're talking about the WebDriver protocol, what will happen is on the left, you would have or your local machine, or you would have your pipeline. You would create an automation script with or Selenium or with Appium. And let's, for example, say we want to open a URL in a browser. That means we would create a script and we would say driver.get URL. We would execute that. And what will happen then is that our automation framework will use a browser or a mobile driver to communicate with or the mobile device or with the desktop browser. This will just do a single request. But what will also happen is that we will get back a response. The device or the mobile browser gives back a response that goes through the mobile or the browser driver that will go back to our automation framework that is hosted on a local machine or maybe also hosted in our pipeline. And if you would look at this, these are basically HTTPS calls that are being done, the communication between your script, between your driver and between your automation or basically your application on the mobile device or in the browser itself. And the WebDriver protocol can be seen also as, we call it black box testing, where you would test something from the outside instead of like unit testing. With unit testing, we can call that for example, white box testing, where you have access to the source code. That's not what you have currently with the WebDriver protocol. So this is how the WebDriver protocol works. So now let's go to those native frameworks. Oh yeah, one thing I forgot to mention. If you're going to use the WebDriver protocol, then you could see that you might have some latency, not when you're executing it on your local machine, but for example, when you execute something in the cloud. And that latency has to do with the fact that the commands need to go from your script on your local machine or in your pipeline to the device and get back, and to the device and get back. That might add some extra latency. And that's basically how almost all cloud vendors, but also SauceLabs is working, sending HTTP calls from your framework to the devices or to the desktop VMs. But now let's also take a look at those native protocols. What do we mean with that? Well, let's first start with the left part, the JavaScript web-based automation tools. What we mean with that, take for example, Cypress, TestCafe, Playwright, or Puppeteer. What they do is you will create your script and they communicate with the browser. But the difference in comparison to the WebDriver protocol is that they can interact directly with the browser. They do that with, for example, an iframe, as you would see maybe with Cypress. They could do it with a proxy, which is being done by TestCafe, or by using some browser APIs, which is being done by Playwright. And that makes it a little bit or much faster in comparison to the WebDriver-based protocols. On the other hand, because you can communicate directly with the browser, you also have access to some source code. You could manipulate stuff in that browser to make test cases easier, to see if certain functionality is being called without even touching the UI itself. That's the advantage of the JavaScript web-based automation tools. And now let's also take a look at those native apps-based automation tools. And with that, we mean, for example, Espresso and XCUITest. What happened with those tools? If you create a test case, you need to have an application. With Espresso and XCUITest, you can automate native applications. So if we're going to execute a test case, for example, from a local machine on the device with Espresso and XCUITest, you would get, for example, an application under test. That's the application that you need to test. But those frameworks also install an extra application, which is basically the application that will hold your test cases. And what will then happen is that both applications can communicate with each other. So if you compare that to the WebDriver protocol, both protocols that you see here for the JavaScript web-based automation tools and for the native apps-based automation tools basically behave in the same context. They interact with each other. That also makes the difference between the native protocols and the WebDriver protocols, they all behave in the context of the app under test. And that made us think, because we as SauceLabs are built to use the Selenium, the WebDriver Protocol, accepting HTTP calls from you or from your framework at least. And we were not built to basically communicate with applications in the same infrastructure. And that's why we built SauceCTL, one runner to rule them all. And you might wonder, what is SauceCTL? Well, you can already see it here. It's a small package, which is a command line interface that can help you execute your test cases, which are, for example, in Cypress or in Playwright or in TestCafe or in Espresso or in XCUITest. Push them to the SauceLabs cloud. Everything will be executed in the SauceLabs cloud. And when it's done, a status will be sent back. And then you would have all the data in SauceLabs. And the things that, for example, SauceCTL can do, it can execute your test cases on 100 types of devices if you're using Espresso XCUITest. It even supports sharding, basically dividing the test cases over multiple instances. Different browsers, well, you can already read it, what you see here. There are some asterisks here. Keep in the back of your mind that we can only support what the automation framework that you're going to use is supporting. So for example, if you want to use Cypress and you want to run Cypress test cases on SauceLabs, then you will not get IE11 support because SauceLabs has IE11. No, you can only use the things that Cypress is supporting, meaning Edge, Firefox, and Chrome. And you can also not run Cypress test cases on real devices or in emulators and simulators because that's not something that Cypress supports. So be aware of the fact that if you're going to use a certain framework and you want to use SauceCTL, then you can only run on the things on the browsers or devices that the framework is also supporting. So enough about this. Let's take a look at where it started, because it started in 2020, if I'm correct, in 2020. And in 2020, we saw that Cypress was being used more and more and more. So we started by supporting Cypress in our cloud, basically pushing your test cases to SauceLabs, execute them and get the status back. And then we also supported Playwright, and we also supported TestCafe. And when we were doing this, and we were using the SauceCTL runner, we saw that we had gold in our hands, like basically Gollum had here. We thought this is really useful. We could do more with it. So in the end, we also used the same runner to give you the option to run Espresso and also XCUI test cases. Because like I already mentioned before, what will happen here is that the test cases will be uploaded and it's using the infrastructure in SauceLabs to execute those test cases. So let's dive a little bit more into how to use SauceCTL. If you want to use SauceCTL for the JavaScript web-based automation tools, then you want to use this protocol. Basically, your script will communicate directly with the browser. And what will happen if you're using SauceCTL? You can run this from your local machine or from your pipeline. You need to configure it, and this is something that we will show based on different automation frameworks. Then after the configuration, you specify what you want to do. Then the test will be uploaded to the SauceLabs cloud. They will be executed there. And the SauceCTL runner will only verify, are you done? Are you done? And if it's done, it can basically determine the status, if it's passed or failed. And last but not least, what you can also do is all the statics that are being generated on SauceLabs, video and that kind of logs can also automatically be downloaded on your local machine or in your pipeline. So let's take a look at let's take a look at Playwright. And let's start with a very simple example. We want to start by running Playwright just as a developer, as a QA engineer. You have a set running on your local machine. What do you need to do to make this run on SauceLabs? Then we will also look into the installation. We create some basic configuration and then run it on SauceLabs. And also we're going to look into how can you use SauceCTL and run your test cases in SauceLabs, even if you need to use internal websites. Is that also possible? So websites that are behind a firewall? Yes, it is. So we will show that later on. So let's start with this. This is just a basic example of running multiple test cases on your local machine with Playwright. What you see here is just a simple suite for a login page that will run test cases on the SAUCE demo application. And if we would run this on our local machine, we can spin it up without a browser, or basically a headful browser, or with a browser, as you can see here. But this is basically what we're going to do. We're going to use this suite, and we're going to run this on SauceLabs by just downloading the runner, creating a configuration file, and just run it. Hopefully that should not be too difficult. The examples that we're going to use here for Playwright, for TestCafe, Cypress, for Espresso, and XCUITest can also be downloaded and be watched on GitHub, and we will share all the information afterwards with you. So now let's take a look. If you want to start, for example, with Playwright, you can go to our new documentation site. And there you will find more information on how to install SauceCTL. But we're going to do that now. Let's take a look at it. If you have that same project that we just demoed before, the only thing that you need to do is install the SauceCTL runner as an NPM package. Make it part of your dependencies, as you can see here. And when you installed it, you can now create a configuration file. It's basically a YAML file, and that YAML file can be generated with this command, the SauceCTL init. And when you run the SauceCTL init, you will get a few questions. For example, which data center do you want to run it on? Which framework do you want to use? Which version of Playwright do you want to use? Which browser you want to use? Just some basic questions. You can always change them afterwards. And as you can see also here, we ask you if you want to download the artifacts, yes or no. As you can see here, 2 extra files are being created. And the most important one can be found here in the configuration file, where you would have certain properties that are useful for you to look at least. Here you can see, for example, the SAUCE configuration, where you see the region, the concurrency. And what we mean with concurrency is if you would have multiple suites, which we will show you later on, if you would have multiple suites, then this is the amount of VMs you can use in SauceLabs to divide those test cases between. Then you provide, for example, the Playwright version. You can find more information on our documentation site. And you can provide a suite. And basically a suite is just a set of test cases. If you do not provide a location of a specific set, it will just use the root directory with the test cases, push them to SauceLabs, and run them all. But basically it's just one execution on one virtual machine on SauceLabs. And if we have everything like this, we provide, for example, the platform and the browser name here. We can also determine if we want to store the artifacts, and then we can say just run it. So install it, create a configuration file, and now we say SauceCTL run. And what will happen now is it will package the test cases, it will push them to SauceLabs, it will start a VM, and it will execute the test cases on SauceLabs, as you can see in a few seconds. We can now already see here, we see that the Playwright Windows 10 Chromium test case is now running. So the only thing we now need to do is just wait. And I already speeded up this test, execution. So in a few seconds, the test will be done and you would have the status here. Now you can go to SauceLabs and show the results or view the results. So we see the test case, it's done here. You click on it and you would have your video. The logs, it's something we need to work on for Playwright because they changed something. We're working on this and it should be fixed in a few weeks. But basically you would see the test execution on SauceLabs. And all the assets that you see here will also automatically be downloaded. You've got the video, you've got the extra logs, and you even have the configuration file that's being pushed to SauceLabs, the configuration file that we used. And also in the metadata tab, that's basically the tab that you would also have with Selenium or Appium test cases. You can find more information. And like I mentioned, the artifacts are automatically downloaded after every successful test execution. But you can also say only download it when it's failed. Otherwise, just use the SauceLabs cloud and you will have them there for at least 30 days. So enough about this. If you want to know more about the configuration of Playwright, what you could do with Playwright, which options you can provide in that configuration file, you can go to also the configuration page for Playwright. Every framework has its own configuration page. We will share the slides afterwards, so you will also have the links afterwards. I also mentioned that I wanted to show you an example where you could use a website which is in your internal network. And what you just saw there was a website that was hosted on my local machine. The only thing I now need to do is just change it to the internal address, and I need to provide a tunnel. And what I mean with a tunnel is you can use SauceConnect to make a connection between SauceLabs and your local machine. You already saw it in the video that the SauceConnect tunnel called SauceCTL-tunnel was started. So we only need to tell the configuration file by providing a tunnel and an ID that it needs to use this tunnel. And to make it a little bit more clear in SauceLabs, I'm also going to change the name of the test case. And I'm going to limit the amount of test cases. I just want to create one test case, want to execute one test case. So it's now only going to execute the login.spec.js. I think it's 3 or 4 test cases. So if I would now execute it, you would see it running here on SauceLabs. You can also see that the shield is also dark, meaning that a SauceConnect tunnel is used. And when the test execution is done, you can verify here on the shield, you see a number. That means it used the SauceConnect tunnel. And if I would view also the video, then I would also see, let me just wait here. You can see here locally hosted. I added an extra banner in the website. This is using the local host on my machine. So you can even use Cypress, you can use TestCafe, you can use Playwright by using a tunnel and connect it to your internal network or to your internal website. Just run it in the SauceLabs cloud on multiple browsers. So more details about certain configurations and the real power will be shown also by Eyal when he's going to demo the Cypress test cases. So now that we've seen this, let's also take a look at TestCafe. And again, for TestCafe, we're going to use the same system. We're going to run test cases on our local machine, just to see how easy it is when we create that configuration, how to run it on SauceLabs. And with TestCafe, we now also support running it on iOS simulators. We're working on support for the Android emulators, but you can now also use TestCafe to run test cases on SauceLabs on iOS simulators. So what do you need to do? Well, this is basically our local test execution. Just want to show you, run a simple test case. In TestCafe, it will spin up that browser. It will use a proxy to communicate with the website. It will execute a simple test case here to log in. And when that is done, TestCafe will also show you the results in the console. So, and yes, it's done now. But if you want to run this on SauceLabs, the only thing you need to do is, again, install the package with, it's an npm package. Just so do npm install SauceCTL. Add it to your dependencies, and then you can run it on SauceLabs. Also something which is shown here in the configuration. And something I forgot to mention in the Playwright example, all frameworks that you're going to use only need to use your user and your access key, your username and your access key. You can find them also in SauceLabs under your own account. Make sure that you add them or in an environment variable or in environment variables in your pipeline. If that's there, the username and the access key, then you could easily run those test cases like you would normally do that with Selenium or Appium test cases from your local machine or from your pipeline. So again, let's get back. We added the SauceCTL. This is the configuration file. But what you can also see here is that you can now also provide simulators. We have test cases we want to run on Windows 10 Chrome. We're only going to focus on the login spec. And we can run it on iOS Safari by providing a new suite and then providing the simulator. We want to run it on, for example, an iPhone 12 simulator with platform version 14.3. Oh, I was too fast with that one. Sorry. Let's go back to this one. Yes. By running SauceCTL run, again, it will push the test cases to SauceLabs. It will spin up, in this case, a browser and the simulator. And when this is done, you can view the results here for TestCafe, also with the logs on the right. You would have your video on the left. and you would also have all the reports, all the configuration files that you need to have, also with the metadata. But I think most important here in this case is the example to run it on an iOS simulator if you want to do that. Same, also all the artifacts can be downloaded also on your local machine. If you want to know more about the configuration options you have with TestCafe, again, please take a look at the Test Runner Toolkit configuration page for TestCafe, and you can find on the right all the options you have. Now we've talked about Playwright and TestCafe, but what about Cypress? Well, Eyal is going to tell you more about Cypress. So Eyal, floor is yours.
Thanks, Wim. So last but not least, for the JS framework is Cypress. So same as we did with the previous frameworks, also with Cypress, we will demo running Cypress test on the local Chrome browsers, installations of source control, create basic configurations and run it on SauceLabs, and the power of source control. Different configurations, an example for running Cypress on Sauce platform. So let's first start by running my current Cypress test on a Chrome browser. Under the integration folders, I can see all my Cypress tests. I can run also locally using the run command, but here I will open the Cypress UI. And it should take a few seconds, 5-10 seconds to open it. And again, that's for running it on my local Chrome browser, on my local machine. And now I can run all my tests, or here I will run on my local Chrome only the login suite that contains 3 tests. And as you can see, all tests run and pass. As we mentioned, also here in our docs, you will find all the info you need about Cypress on Sauce, Cypress versions and browser versions that we support, how to install SauceCTL, how to run, and more. So now I want to show you how to create the basic configuration file. As you can see, I already installed SauceCTL in my package. So I can see that SauceCTL, I can see the SauceCTL versions, and I can also see that in the package. If it is not installed, I need to install the SauceCTL package with the npm install, as Wim mentioned. Now I will create a basic configuration file with the init command. I will select the data center, the Cypress framework, the versions, the Cypress configuration file, and that I want to run my test on Chrome and Windows 10. 2 files were created. Okay, I can see that the source ignore with the files that will not be uploaded to Sauce when running the test, and the configuration file. In the configuration file, we can see the data center that we will use, the locations of the Cypress configuration file, and in the suite, we define that we will run all our tests on Chrome browser. Now we can run the configuration we just created with the run command. So we start to run. We can now switch to Sauce platforms and see the execution. And soon the test finished, yes. And when the test finished to run, we have all the logs and the executions video also in the artifacts folder. And of course, if we switch back to Sauce, we have all the logs. Also from Sauce, we have access to all the logs for each suite and spec we run. In the metadata, and in the metadata, we have more information. And of course, we have the videos of the executions of all the spec. You can read more about the configurations in our docs site, and I want to show you, but here I want to show you some example how you can leverage your test on Sauce Cloud. So before, we ran all our tests in one browser, and it took 1 minute and 44 seconds. Okay, and after we can reduce the time by splitting, and we use the test file parameter and define which test to run on each browser. In this demo, we run a small number of Cypress tests, so we don't save much time. But on more enormous suites, splitting the test and run them in parallel will make a difference. Now for the next example, locally we run our test on Chrome. Here we can run the same test on different browsers and they all run in parallel. And same as before, but here I want to show you how we can run the same test on different browser versions. So I selected, so I had to do the configuration file, latest -1, latest -2 versions, and they all run in parallel on the right versions, Chrome versions. Now for the last part, and in the last part is focusing on the native frameworks, Espresso and XCUITest. As you hopefully remember, the native frameworks directly interact with the device. All test commands are executed on the device itself. In the configurations file, we have the instructions how we want to run our test on Sauce. Which devices, which emulators, which apps we need to upload to Sauce for testing. And the apps are uploaded to Sauce, the tests run on Sauce devices or emulators, and we get back the result. So I will start with demo about Espresso, and Wim will demo running on XCUITest. So I will demo running Espresso tests for my machines on a local emulator, installations of SauceCTL, create a basic configurations and run it on Sauce, and as before, the power of SauceCTLs. Different configurations and example for running Espresso on Sauce platform. Okay, so let's start first. Let's first start by running my current Espresso test on local emulator. So what you can see here, that is from Android Studio, the test run on a local emulators on my local machine. All the tests from these packages are running, but note that in the end of the executions, I don't have any logs or videos of the execution. So I run it and I can see that everything is run or the error that I have, but I don't have the videos or logs about that. In our docs, you will find all the info about testing with Espresso and XCUITest on Sauce, how to install SauceCTLs, how to handle Sauce credentials, how to run your test, and more. Now, I want to show how to create the basic configuration file as we did before. we need to have the two applications, the application to test, and the application to test, and the test application that includes and contains the Espresso test to run. First, we need to install the SauceCTLs, and we will use the bash command to install the latest versions of SauceCTLs. I can check the versions and make sure that SauceCTL is installed. Now I'll create the basic configuration file. Okay, so now I'll run the init command. I will select data center, the data center that I want to run, the Espresso framework, and the two apps and the two applications we need for testing. The application to test and the test application that contains the Espresso test. I can select a device pattern, for example, to run on any available Samsung device, and I can also specify emulator that I want to run. In the end of the configuration, a configuration file was created. And as before, in the configurations file, we can see the data center that we will use, the apps that will be uploaded to source for running the Espresso test, and the suite that define what we'll run, that we will run our test on any available Samsung device and emulators. Now we can run the configurations we just created that already started. Please note that to save time in the apps, if the apps were already uploaded to SauceLabs, we don't need to upload them again, just save time. So you can see that here we are not uploading the apps again because it's already on Sauce. We can switch to the Sauce platform and see the executions on the real device and on the emulators. So now the tests from the Espresso test are running. And when the test finished to run, we can switch back to Sauce, and we can see all the. If you go to the device, we can see all the Espresso tests that run from the two packages. And in the real device, we have also the device log, if we need, and we have in the metadata, we have more information about the executions. From the executions of the emulators, if I click on the executions URL from the emulators, we can see that for emulators, we have more logs if needed. You can see here all the logs that we can use to investigate it and to take a look what was done during the run. And of course, we have the video. So just we'll play the video. Okay, so we'll play the video on the emulators, and we can see that all the tests run on the emulators. And we can also, after that, we can switch back to the real device and just show you that the video on the real device that you can also download from the metadata. You can also download this video if needed. And as before, you can read more about the configurations in our docs site. And I want to show you some examples how you can leverage your test on Sauce Cloud with Espresso. In these examples, we run our test in parallel on any available Samsung device and a Sony device. Okay, so we can see in the executions. And here you can see an example if you want to run in parallel on specific Android devices, sorry, on specific Android versions. So we specify the Android versions that we want. And in the report, we see the Android versions that it will run on the Android versions that we defined. Using annotations. So we want to run tests from specific annotations. Here we run 2 tests from 2 different packages that have the API flow annotation. So we can see that we want to run the API flow annotations, and the 2 tests run on SauceLabs. In this example, we run a test from login test package on a specific device. We are using the ID parameters and on emulator. And we run a different test from the same login test package on a second emulator. And in the result, we can see here 1 execution on the specific device. And if we switch to the virtual cloud, we can see 2 executions on the emulator. The last example is using shard. So shard is that we specify the number of devices we have, and Espresso will split our test between the devices. So here we specify 4 devices, and we have 6 tests from 2 packages. So Espresso will split the test between the 4 devices. So 2 devices run 2 tests, and 2 devices run 1 test each. So it's 6 tests on 4 devices. And now back to you, Wim, for the XCUITest demo.
Thanks, Eyal. Yeah, and just one thing that I wanted to mention: everything that you saw with the extra options you have to configure, running it in parallel, looking for certain devices, is basically also the same for XCUITest. And for this case, we're also going to use the same setup. I already have a running suite on my local machine, and we're going to create that basic configuration and run it on SauceLabs real iOS devices. We currently do not support it on iOS simulators. We're working on that, but for now, you can already run your XCUITest test cases on the SauceLabs real iOS devices. So let's take a look at our local suite. What we have here are multiple test cases for XCUITest, and we can just run this specific flow on our local simulator. This is also what we're going to use in the demo. We're going to use the test app that is being created by XCUITest, and we're going to use the application under test. We're going to push them to the SauceLabs cloud with the SauceCTL runner, and we're going to run those test cases on an iOS real device. And in a few seconds, this one will be ready when it executed all the test cases, verified everything, and we're almost done. And yes, we're done. So basically all test cases succeeded on my local machine. And now the only thing I want to do is run this on SauceLabs. Same suite. What do I need to do? Well, first of all, you need to go to the documentation page if you want to know more about how to set this up, how to download SauceCTL. One important thing, Eyal also mentioned that if you want to start here with Espresso and XCUITest and SauceCTL, do not use the NPM package. 9 out of 10 times your environment, if you're developing native applications and want to test with Espresso and XCUITest, you don't have a node environment. That's why we also provide you with an option to download it through a curl command. And you can easily add that as a precondition in your pipeline or as a precondition when you start this for the first time on your local machine. So what we need to do is we need to create that configuration file. Again, with sauce init, we provide the region, we provide the framework, and we provide the applications. Then we can also say on which devices we want to run it. In this case, I said, just give me an iPhone, an available iPhone. And we also, again, want to download the artifacts. When this is set up, we have a configuration file. And as you can see here again, we've got a sauce region with a concurrency and yeah, basically the basic setup for this configuration file. Then the demo application and the test application, and we want to run it on SauceLabs on just an available iPhone device. We can also specify a specific device, as Eyal already showed with Espresso, by just providing the ID and the specific name of that device, which you can find in the SauceLabs cloud. Now it's going to push the applications to SauceLabs. You go to SauceReel, you see the test case being executed. And when it is done, we can go back to SauceLabs, open the settings, or basically opening the session. And we can also see on the SauceLabs cloud what was happening. We can see all the test cases here. And again, we also have the logs, and you can also download the artifacts afterwards. So hopefully you now have an idea how to use it. And before we dive a little bit further, again, this is the configuration page specifically for XCUITest test cases. There's one thing that I wanted to get back to. In one of the first slides that we've shown you about SauceCTL, we've shown you also a lot of options like emulators, simulators, number of shards. So if you want to automatically divide them, please check the configuration options. Most of the times, all the configuration options are the same, but we are busy with supporting basically the generic options like sharding. It's currently not supported for XCUITest, but it will be in the future. If you want to know more on how to do this, how to use Playwright, TestCafe, Cypress, Espresso, or XCUITest, you can find all the links here. We will share the documentation. We will share the slides afterwards with all the links. And especially for Espresso and XCUITest, you will get another link to a demo repository where you would see around, 6 to 10 different types of configurations, how you can configure your configuration file, your YAML file, to connect to certain devices, use sharding, divide test cases over multiple instances. Hopefully that will help you to start running with one of these frameworks by just using the runner, the SauceCTL runner, basically one runner to rule them all the automation frameworks that you see here. So hopefully you had enough information now about how to use it. But I can imagine that you also have some questions. So we still have a few minutes left for some questions. So I don't know, Madeline, did we also got some questions we can answer?
Yes. So we've got one in the questions pane, which says, which is from Stephen. Are there any plans to support the Detox framework for the testing React native apps?
Good question, Stefan. We're currently investigating in which frameworks we could also support by using this specific runner. Detox is a little bit different, because with Detox, we need to have communication also with the Metro server. And when you need to have the Metro bundler server, you also need to have the source code. So we're basically trying to figure out how we could do that, because with Detox, you have your test cases basically in your test app. And yeah, it's a little bit more difficult in running those test cases. We're investigating it, and hopefully we could support it in the future, but it all depends on how easy it will be to basically copy everything to the SauceLabs cloud. And I hope that answered also your question, Stefan.
Okay, so we have a couple more that were sent in before the webinar. So let me just see what they were. So for the Espresso tests, you mentioned that 2 APK files are uploaded to source. My Espresso tests are in more than one APK. Can I upload more APKs for testing if needed?
I think this one is for you, Eyal.
Yes, a good question. So from the last few days, it's a good question because from the last few days, we also support. So if you have APK files with dependencies, so you don't need to upload only 2 APK files, as I mentioned, you can also upload more APK files with dependencies. So the answer is yes, you can do that. And hopefully it's already in our documentation. If not, in a few days, it will be uploaded to our documentations.
Great. And just the last question, can we also run Selenium frameworks in the SauceLabs cloud as we can do with Cypress, Playwright, and TestCafe, for example, a Java framework?
Yeah, I think a good question. Currently, we do not support the Selenium frameworks because you have different frameworks out there, how you write your Java framework, how you write your Ruby framework. So currently, we're only focusing on the native frameworks where there is a direct interaction between and the test code and the browser / the device itself. Maybe in the future, I'm not 100% sure how that will work, but for now we're only focusing on the frameworks that have a direct interaction, basically behave in the context of the app under test. So hopefully that also answers the question.
Just to mention that it's for the SauceCTL. So running Selenium, it was for many years we support Selenium test, of course, but using that with SauceCTL. So that's what I assume, Wim, that's what you
exactly
meant,
yeah. Thanks for adding that information.
Okay.
Are there any other questions, Madeline?
Not that I have. We can give people a couple of minutes if they wanted to submit any more questions, but I don't have any more. Okay,
cool. Well, then I would want to thank everybody for joining this webinar. Like Madeline already mentioned, you will get the recordings, and I think she will also mention that in a few seconds. If you do have any questions about using SauceCTL, you can go to docs.saucelabs.com. You will find more information on how to configure it, and hopefully you will enjoy using it because it can make your life much easier. Thanks for being here.